My name is Julius Hayes, and I am 70 years old. At my daughter's graduation, after I had spent a lifetime building her future, she told me I was the one thing holding her back. She thought her fancy new degree gave her the right to cash in on my life's work, starting with the house I built with my own two hands. She thought she was breaking an old man that day. She had no idea she was forging a weapon. Before I tell you how I turned her ambition into ashes and taught her the real meaning of inheritance, please hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see how far a father's story can travel. The May air in Charlotte was thick and heavy, the kind that settles on your skin like a damp blanket. But I hardly noticed. My only wool suit, the one I saved for weddings and funerals, felt tight across my shoulders under the North Carolina sun, but inside my chest there was a different kind of warmth. It was pride. A blazing, powerful feeling that swelled up so high it almost made me dizzy. My daughter, my only child. Brianna was about to receive her master's in business administration. My hands calloused and scarred from a lifetime spent as a master mechanic gently held a bouquet of yellow roses. They weren't the most expensive flowers, but they were Diane's favorite. My late wife. Diane would have been so proud. I could picture her smile as bright as the blooms themselves. She always believed in Brianna, even when Brianna didn't believe in herself. "She's got your fire in her, Julius," she used to tell me. "Just needs the right wind and it'll roar." For years I had tried to be that wind for her. The double shifts at the garage, the sleepless nights worrying over bills, the loans I took out to make sure she had the best education money could buy, it was all for this moment. I pictured myself wrapping my arms around her, feeling the hard-earned diploma against her back and whispering, "I'm proud of you, baby girl. Your mama would be too." Her name was called Brianna Hayes Thompson. I clapped so hard a few people in the row ahead of me turned to look. She moved across the stage with a grace and confidence that seemed otherworldly, a woman in full command of her future. She was no longer my skinny little girl with pigtails I always had to fix. When the ceremony ended, the crowd spilled onto the lawn, a sea of black robes and beaming faces. I navigated through the chaos, the bouquet held out in front of me like a shield. Then I saw her. She was standing with her husband, Kyle. He was a white man who always wore expensive suits and talked like he'd just stepped out of a commercial for a hedge fund. They weren't alone. They were deep in conversation with an older white couple, impeccably dressed and dripping with quiet wealth. The woman wore a string of pearls so large I wondered how her neck could support them. Brianna's smile was radiant, but it wasn't the smile I knew. It was a calculated, polished smile, the kind she used for job interviews. As I approached, their conversation paused. Kyle saw me first. He didn't bother to hide the flicker of annoyance in his eyes before plastering on a synthetic grin. "Julius, glad you could make it." His voice was too loud, too performative. Brianna turned. For a fraction of a second, I saw her polished smile vanish, but what replaced it wasn't joy. It was a cold, hard freeze. Her eyes scanned my suit, my old shoes, then the flowers. The wealthy couple looked at me with a polite curiosity, the kind of look you give a waiter who has accidentally wandered into your private party. I felt myself shrink under their gaze. I stepped forward, offering the flowers. "Congratulations, baby girl," I said, my voice thick with emotion. She made no move to take them. She stared at the bouquet as if it were a snake. Kyle placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that looked supportive but I knew was about control. "Your mother would be so proud," I said, trying to fill the awkward silence. And that's when she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud or angry. It was cold, sharp, and perfectly modulated to be heard only by those in our small circle. "Proud you raised me," she repeated, a cruel little smirk playing on her lips. "I spent my whole life wishing someone else had. Anyone but you." The words hit me like broken glass. The air was sucked from my lungs. The wealthy couple looked shocked, then quickly masked it with embarrassment. Kyle wasn't surprised at all. He just tightened his grip on Brianna's back, a nearly invisible, triumphant smile flashing across his face. He knew this was coming. He'd planned it. Time seemed to stop. I stared at my daughter's face, searching for a trace of the little girl I raised, a flicker of regret, a moment of hesitation. There was nothing. Her eyes were like ice. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. What was the point? She had spoken her truth. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my hand back. I looked down at the yellow roses, their vibrant petals now seeming to mock me. They were a tribute to a dead woman's love and a living man's sacrifice, and both had just been discarded. I turned to a nearby stone bench and gently placed the bouquet on the empty seat. I straightened my tie out of a mindless, nervous habit. Then, without another word, without another look, I turned my back on my daughter, my son-in-law, and the future I had worked so hard to build for her. And I walked away. Every step on that perfect green lawn felt like walking on hot coals. My 1998 Ford F-150 groaned to life. The familiar rumble, usually a source of comfort, sounded foreign and hollow. I pulled out of the university parking lot, not looking back. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the cab was nearly unbearable. It pressed in on me, amplifying the sound of Brianna's voice replaying over and over in my head. Anyone but you. The familiar streets of Charlotte slid past the window in a blur. The park where I taught her to ride a bike. The ice cream shop we went to after every good report card. Each landmark was another twist of the knife. Where did I go wrong? The question was a relentless, unanswerable drumbeat. I gave her everything I had. Apparently it wasn't what she wanted. She wanted a different father, a different life, a different past. When I got home, the silence followed me inside. This small brick house tucked away in our working-class neighborhood was the one place on earth I felt completely myself. Diane and I had bought the land with our savings and built most of the house ourselves. Every brick, every plank of wood was soaked in our sweat and our love. Diane called it our fortress. I walked into the living room and my heart seized. On the mantelpiece was the last photo we took as a family of 3 before the cancer took Diane. Brianna was 16, grinning with her arms thrown around both our necks. Where did the girl in that picture go? I drifted into the kitchen. My hand unconsciously brushed over the worn Formica countertop. I remembered Diane standing right here kneading dough for biscuits while a tiny Brianna sat on the linoleum floor banging on pots and pans. I touched the floral armchair in the corner. That was Diane's chair. After she passed, I could never bring myself to sit in it. It remained a silent monument. I saw the faint scratch on the hardwood floor where Brianna had knocked over the Christmas tree when she was 7. I'd been angry, but Diane had just laughed and said, "Julius, those are life marks. It means our house is living." Now it felt like it was dying. Brianna's words had poisoned the air, turning sweet memories into bitter accusations. This house wasn't a fortress. It was a museum of a life my daughter apparently despised. I was sitting in the kitchen staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold when the doorbell rang. I knew it was them. Part of me wanted to bolt the door and pretend I wasn't home. But that wasn't my way. I opened it. Brianna and Kyle stood on the porch. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Kyle, on the other hand, looked directly at me, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Julius, we were worried about you." He began walking past me into the house without an invitation. What Brianna said, "She's just been under a lot of stress. This whole semester has been intense." His performance was insulting. He walked around my living room touching things as if he were appraising them. "You've kept this place in good shape," he remarked. "It's got good bones. That's a real estate term." I said nothing. I just waited. I knew this was not an apology visit. They followed me into the kitchen. Brianna sat at the table, fiddling with her fingers. Kyle remained standing, asserting his presence. "Listen, Julius," he continued, his tone shifting from fake sympathy to condescending practicality. "We know today was difficult, but that's exactly why we need to talk practically, about the future." Kyle placed a polished leather briefcase on my kitchen table. The snap of the latches echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick sheaf of documents and slid them across the table toward me. "This is an opportunity," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "A biotech startup. We've got a chance to get in on the ground floor, but to secure the business loan we need collateral." I looked down at the papers. They were full of charts and jargon I didn't understand, but I understood the document on top. It was a home equity line of credit application, and the address listed was my address. "The equity in this house in this market has to be at least $500,000, Kyle said quickly. "We're not selling it, of course, we're just leveraging it. That's how the wealthy do it, Julius. They make their assets work for them." Finally, Brianna spoke. Her voice was small, but it held no remorse. Dad, it's just an old house in a neighborhood that's going downhill. It's time to make it useful. Useful. My entire life, Diane's entire legacy reduced to a number on a balance sheet. And in that moment, it all clicked into place. The scene at the graduation wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a premeditated attack, a tactic. They wanted to break me emotionally to make me feel small and worthless so that when they made this demand, I would be too defeated to fight back. I looked from the documents to Kyle's eager face, then to my daughter's tense one. They expected me to yell or cry or surrender. I did none of those things. A surprising cold clarity moved through my veins, extinguishing the pain and replacing it with something harder, sharper. Resolve. I gently pushed the stack of papers back toward them. "Let me think about it," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. My quiet refusal caught them off guard. They exchanged a confused look. They had been prepared for an emotional battle, not a calculated delay. "Of course," Kyle said, trying to regain control. "Take your time." But as they left, I knew their time was up. They had started this war, but I would be the one to finish it. The next morning, the pain was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs where my heart used to feel pride. But something else had taken root overnight, a cold, hard resolve that felt like steel reinforcing my spine. I drank my coffee black, letting the bitterness wash away the last of my sorrow and sharpen my focus. I had a plan. It was a long shot, a whisper of an idea inspired by my wife's memory, but it was all I had. And the first step was to buy myself time. My thumb hovered over Brianna's name on my old flip phone. This was the first move in a game I never wanted to play against an opponent I never thought I'd have to face. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient. "Dad, did you think about it?" There was no hello, no how are you, just business. I made my voice sound a little older, a little more confused than I felt. "Brianna, honey, I'm looking for those papers you wanted. The deed to the house. It's an old house, you know, and your mother handled most of the paperwork. I think it's up in the attic somewhere in one of her old boxes." A sigh of pure frustration hissed through the phone. "The attic, Dad, seriously, Kyle's partners are on a timeline. This isn't something we can just put off." I could hear Kyle's voice in the background feeding her lines. "Tell him we need it by tomorrow." I held the phone away from my ear for a second, then brought it back. "It's a mess up there, baby girl. It might take me a few days to sort through everything. My back isn't what it used to be." I hated the lie, hated the weakness I was performing, but it was a necessary shield. "I'll find it," I promised. "Just give me a few days." I hung up before she could argue more. A few days. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was time I had bought with a lie, and I was going to use every second of it. With the few days I had bought myself, I knew I couldn't waste a second. The lie I told Brianna was that the deed was in the attic. The truth was, I knew exactly where the deed was locked safely in my filing cabinet downstairs. But the attic held something far more important. It held the past. It held Diane. And I had a feeling that somewhere up there in the dust and the memories was the answer I was looking for. I pulled down the old folding stairs, each step groaning in protest under my weight. The air that drifted down smelled of old wood, aging paper, and time itself. A single beam of sunlight cut through the gloom from a small round window at the far end, illuminating a universe of swirling dust motes. I hadn't been up here since Diane passed. It was her domain, a library of our life together that I hadn't had the strength to face. But now that history was the only thing that could save me. The attic was a sea of memories. In one corner stood Brianna's old crib, the one I had assembled myself. Next to it was my old army trunk, and stacked high against the wall were boxes of Christmas decorations, each one holding a ghost of a holiday past. I navigated through the labyrinth of our life, my hand trailing over a dusty rocking horse and a box labeled Brianna's school projects. I wasn't searching for a piece of paper. I was searching for the sign for a piece of Diane's strength to guide me. Tucked away under a heavy canvas tarp, I found it, a large cedar chest. It was Diane's hope chest, a gift from her mother that she had repurposed to store the things that mattered most to her. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool wood before lifting the heavy lid. A faint scent of cedar and old perfume rose to meet me. Inside it wasn't filled with linens or silver. It was filled with her life's passion. On top was a scrapbook, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it to find dozens of newspaper clippings from the Charlotte Observer. The headlines jumped out at me. Local residents protest rezoning plan. Community gardens take root in West Charlotte. Julius Hayes speaks out against predatory developers. I saw pictures of my wife not as the quiet woman who made biscuits in our kitchen, but as a fiery activist standing on a makeshift stage with a megaphone in her hand, her eyes blazing with conviction. I had forgotten this part of her, the warrior who fought tooth and nail to protect our neighborhood from the very kind of greed that was now sitting at my kitchen table. Beneath the scrapbook were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. I untied one. It was from a neighbor whose home was facing foreclosure. The letter thanked Diane for organizing a fundraiser that helped them keep their house. "You are the heart of this neighborhood, Diane," it read. "You remind us that we are not alone." I closed my eyes, her spirit feeling so close in that moment. She didn't just live in our house. She lived in the heart of our entire community. She saw our home not as an asset to be leveraged, but as an anchor for everyone around us. How could I have forgotten that? How could Brianna have never learned it? At the very bottom of the chest, I found a small plain box. Inside, on a bed of cotton, was a single crisp business card. It read, "Reed and Associates Attorneys at Law," and underneath a name, Franklin Reed. Frank was an old friend, a good man who had given Diane pro bono advice during her community battles. He had passed away years ago, but I knew his son had taken over the practice. A spark ignited in my mind. It was more than a spark, it was a flame. Holding that small piece of cardboard, everything suddenly became clear. This wasn't about winning a fight against my daughter. It was about honoring the legacy of my wife. Brianna wanted to turn our home into money, but Diane had already turned it into something far more valuable, a cornerstone of a community. The plan began to form in my mind, a strategy so perfect, so fitting, that I knew deep in my bones it was what Diane would have wanted. I had found my weapon. It wasn't anger, it was legacy. After finding the lawyer's card, I knew my path forward was clear, but there was one more thing I needed to do before I left the attic. I needed to face the full, unvarnished truth of my sacrifice. Tucked behind my old army trunk was a worn, dark green accordion file. The label, written in Diane's neat cursive, simply read, "Brianna, Education." My hands hesitated for a moment. Opening this file felt like willingly touching a hot stove, but I knew I had to. I needed to arm myself not just with Diane's spirit, but with cold, hard facts. I sat down on an old trunk, the single beam of sunlight from the window illuminating the dust that danced around me as I opened the clasp. The file was a paper history of my love and my labor. I started from the very beginning. Small canceled checks for preschool, receipts for private middle school tutors when she struggled with algebra. Then came the bigger numbers. The documents I co-signed for her undergraduate student loans, a debt I was still legally tied to. And finally, the last section, the receipts that hurt the most. Canceled checks from my own retirement savings account written directly to her university's bursar's office. I had drained a significant portion of my nest egg to pay for her MBA because she had tearfully told me how much she wanted to start her career debt-free and ready to conquer the world. I laid the papers out on the floor, my mind a reluctant calculator. $10,000 for tutors, $80,000 for the undergraduate loans I'd co-signed, and then the final staggering sum of over $150,000 for her master's degree. All told, I was looking at $250,000, a lifetime of double shifts, of skipped vacations, of driving the same truck for 20 years, all laid out in a pile of faded paper. It wasn't about the money. I never expected to get a dime of it back. It was about what it represented. To me, it was a gift of love. To her, it was clearly just an investment she felt entitled to. She didn't want my pride. She wanted the rest of my savings. I closed the file. The quiet click of the clasp echoed in the silent attic. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for sentiment. There was only the number, and the path it forced me to take. The following Monday, I drove downtown. Reed and Associates wasn't in one of the gleaming glass skyscrapers that Kyle and Brianna worshipped. It was on the second floor of a modest brick building in a neighborhood that was slowly finding its feet again. The office was small, just a reception area and 2 doors, but it was modern and efficient. No thick carpets or mahogany desks. Just clean lines, contemporary art by local black artists on the walls, and the quiet hum of a computer. It felt like a place where things got done. A young man in a sharp, well-tailored suit came out to greet me. He was tall and carried himself with an easy confidence that reminded me of his father, but his eyes were sharp and focused. This was a new generation. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Anthony Reed. It's an honor to meet you. My father spoke of you and Mrs. Hayes often." His handshake was firm, his grip strong. There was an immediate sense of respect, a bridge between our generations, built on the foundation of my friendship with his father. He led me into his office, which overlooked the street below. He didn't sit behind his large desk, but pulled up a chair to sit across from me at a small round table, making us equals. My assistant said it was a personal matter. He began, his voice calm and professional. "How can I help you?" I didn't start with the legal problem. I started with the human one. I took a deep breath and laid it all out, my voice low and steady. I told him about the graduation, the yellow roses, and the cold, calculated words my daughter had used to cut me to the bone. I told him about their visit, the condescending pitch from my son-in-law, and their demand to use my home, Diane's home, as collateral for a business I knew in my gut was a sham. I didn't let my voice crack. I didn't let a single tear fall. I just presented the facts, a steady, grim accounting of the betrayal. Throughout my story, Anthony Reed didn't interrupt. He just listened. He didn't take notes. His eyes never left my face. He wasn't just hearing the facts of a potential case. He was absorbing the weight of my pain, the depth of my dilemma. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. He leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer just professional, but filled with a quiet, burning indignation. He saw me not as a client, but as an elder of his community who had been profoundly wronged. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice now laced with a steely edge, "they have made a grave mistake. They think they're dealing with a tired old man. They're about to find out they're dealing with Diane Hayes' husband." In that moment, I knew I had found more than a lawyer. I had found an ally. I had found a weapon. I expected him to lay out the usual options. Change the will. Get a restraining order. Maybe sue them for emotional distress. Predictable, messy fights that would drag on for years and leave everyone broken. But Anthony just steepled his fingers, his sharp eyes looking past me for a moment as if he were assembling a complex engine in his mind. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we could certainly do all of those things. We could cut your daughter out of your will. Based on what you've told me, we might even have grounds to file a complaint for attempted elder financial abuse. But all of that is playing defense. It's a reaction to what they've done." He leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze locking onto mine. "From what I remember of Mrs. Hayes, and from what these papers from your attic show me, she didn't play defense. She played offense. She didn't just stop bad things from happening, she built good things in their place." He was right. Diane was a builder of communities of hope, of bridges between people. "Your daughter and her husband," Anthony continued, "they see your house as a pile of cash. They see it as an asset to be liquidated. They're not wrong about its monetary value. This neighborhood, the one your wife fought to protect, is now a prime target for gentrification. Developers are circling like vultures. Your son-in-law is just a small-time vulture trying to get the first bite. So we're not going to give them a fight they expect. We are going to take the battlefield off the map entirely." I must have looked confused because he smiled for the first time, a quick, brilliant flash of confidence. "There's a legal structure, Mr. Hayes. It's elegant, it's powerful, and in your case, it's poetic. It's called a community land trust, or a CLT. He picked up a pen and a legal pad, not to take notes, but to draw a simple diagram. "Think of it like this," he explained, sketching a square on top of a larger rectangle. "Right now, you own the house and the land underneath it as one thing. A CLT allows you to legally separate the two. You would donate the physical house, the building itself, to a non-profit trust. A trust that we will create and name, for example, the Diane Hayes Community Trust." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. My breath caught in my throat. "The trust," he went on, "then owns the building in perpetuity, forever. Its legal mission, which we will write into its very DNA, will be to provide affordable housing for working families in this community. The house can be sold in the future, but only the building, and only to a family that meets certain income criteria at a price that keeps it affordable for the next family and the one after that." He tapped the larger rectangle on the page, the one representing the land. This is the key. The land value, the part that speculators and developers like your son-in-law are drooling over, is taken off the table. It belongs to the community stewarded by the trust. You essentially lock the value of your home to serve the neighborhood, not to enrich an individual. It can never be used as collateral for a private business loan. It can never be flipped for a massive profit. It becomes a permanent anchor of affordability and stability in the neighborhood your wife loved. He put the pen down. Mr. Hayes, with this one legal move, you wouldn't just be stopping your daughter and her husband. You would be taking everything Diane fought for and making it immortal. Her legacy wouldn't be a memory in a dusty box. It would be a living, breathing part of this community, providing a home for a family for generations to come. You'd be turning her greatest love into a fortress no amount of greed could ever tear down. I stared at him, the sheer, beautiful brilliance of it washing over me. It wasn't revenge. It was a resurrection. When Anthony finished speaking, I couldn't respond right away. The air in the office was thick with the weight of his words, with the sheer, unexpected brilliance of the idea. It was a checkmate in a game I didn't even know how to play. For years, my grief over Diane had been a quiet, private thing. Now Anthony was offering me a way to turn that grief into a living monument, a shield, a force for good. I slowly stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling street below without really seeing it. My mind was filled with an image of Diane, not sick in a hospital bed, but vibrant and alive, standing on a makeshift stage with that megaphone, her voice ringing out with passion for her neighbors, for her community. I could almost hear her laughing, that full-throated laugh she had when an idea delighted her. She would have loved this. This plan wasn't born from bitterness or revenge. It was born from the very same principles she lived by. It was a continuation of her work. It was a way to ensure that the love she poured into our home would ripple outward, touching lives for years to come, long after I was gone. Brianna saw a number. Diane saw a community. There was no question which legacy I had to honor. The last of my hesitation vanished, replaced by a certainty so profound it settled deep in my bones. I turned back from the window and faced the young lawyer who had just given me back my purpose. My eyes were clear. My voice when I spoke did not tremble. I looked directly at Anthony Reed and said the truest words I had spoken in a very long time. My wife's legacy is not for sale. I sat back down, a lifetime of sorrow transforming into a single moment of strength. So let's get to work, son. Let's build her that fortress. My meeting with Anthony Reed left me with a clear path and a renewed sense of purpose. Now all I had to do was walk it. The first part of the plan was simple: do nothing. Just wait, and let them unravel. The first call came the next afternoon, just as I was watering Diane's roses. It was Brianna. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice tight with forced casualness. "Just checking in. Any luck finding those papers in the attic?" I could picture her pacing in her minimalist, all-white apartment, Kyle watching her with impatient eyes. I let out a slow breath, making it sound like a weary sigh. "It's a bigger mess up there than I remembered, honey," I said calmly. "Your mother saved everything. I'm working my way through it. It just takes time." I heard a faint, frustrated sound on her end, like a muffled curse, before she said, "Okay, well, just try to hurry," and hung up. The next day it was Kyle. He dispensed with any pretense of friendliness. "Julius," he started, his voice sharp and all business. "We're on a very tight schedule here. Our investors are getting antsy. This isn't just about our timeline anymore. It's about respecting other people's capital. We need to show movement." He was trying to pressure me, using his corporate jargon like a weapon. I didn't rise to the bait. "I understand that, Kyle," I said, my voice even. "I'm an old man moving through 40 years of memories. It is what it is." I could feel his anger simmering through the phone. "Just find it, Julius," he said, and the line went dead. They were getting nervous. Good. The third call came the following morning. It was Brianna again, and the mask of civility had completely shattered. "Dad, this is getting ridiculous." She snapped, her voice high and strained. "It's a single piece of paper. Are you actively trying to sabotage this for us? Do you have any idea what is at stake here? This is our future." I could hear Kyle whispering instructions to her in the background. Her frustration had boiled over into accusation. The daughter who had once asked me to check for monsters under her bed was now treating me like the monster itself. I waited for her to finish her tirade. When she was done, all I said was, "I will call you when I have something to report, Brianna." Then I ended the call. Their impatience was like a compass telling me I was heading in exactly the right direction. Every demanding call, every frustrated sigh wasn't wearing me down. It was just feeding my resolve. The final call came that evening just as I was finishing the dinner dishes. It was Kyle. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct told me I needed to answer. This would be the last one. "Julius," he said. His voice was different this time. The impatience was gone, replaced by a slow, syrupy condescension that made the hairs on my arm stand up. It was the voice of a predator that knows it has cornered its prey. "Brianna and I have been talking," he began, "and we're getting a little concerned. We're worried about you." I said nothing, just listened to the water drip in the sink. "You're 70 years old, Julius. That's a respectable age, but with age can come confusion, especially when it comes to complex financial matters. This house, this asset, it's a big responsibility, and we're worried that perhaps you're not seeing the big picture clearly, that you might be letting sentimentality cloud your judgment." He was laying a trap, and his words were the bait. He was building a narrative, a story he could tell a judge, the story of a confused old man who needed his loving family to step in and manage his affairs for him. I could see the whole disgusting strategy laid out in my mind. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice dripping with false empathy, "when a person isn't able to make the best decisions for themselves, the law has provisions to protect them, to protect their legacy. Families can step in, courts can appoint someone to oversee the assets to ensure they're managed properly." There it was, the threat wrapped in the language of concern. He wasn't just trying to take my house anymore. He was trying to take my mind, my autonomy, my very personhood. He was threatening to strip me of my right to be a man. He thought he was pushing a pawn. He had no idea he was cornering a king. Any last lingering shred of fatherly duty, any microscopic particle of hope for my daughter that might have remained in the deepest corner of my heart, was instantly incinerated. It turned to ash and blew away in the cold wind of his threat. All that was left was a core of pure, unyielding steel. My hand holding the phone was rock steady. The grief was gone, the hurt was gone. All that remained was a chilling, absolute clarity. He had made a fatal mistake. He had shown me his hand, and it was uglier than I could have ever imagined. He expected me to argue, to get flustered, to sound old and confused, and give him the ammunition he needed. I did not give him the satisfaction. I let the silence hang for a beat. Then, in a voice that was as calm and as cold as a winter morning, I said, "Thank you for clarifying your position, Kyle." And I hung up the phone. My thumb didn't even hesitate. I immediately went to my contacts and pressed the name at the top of the list, Anthony Reed. As the phone began to ring, I knew the time for waiting was over. The time for reacting was over. It was time to build, and it was time to burn their plans to the ground. I was in Anthony Reed's office less than an hour after Kyle's threatening phone call. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across his desk, but the fire in my belly was burning brighter than ever. I relayed Kyle's words to him, my voice a low, steady rumble of controlled fury. I told him about the condescending tone, the veiled threats about my mental competence, and the disgusting implication that they would use the courts to strip me of my own life. As I spoke, I saw a change in Anthony's demeanor. The professional calm he usually maintained was replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was the look of a man who not only understood the legal implications, but who was personally offended by the disrespect shown to an elder. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Okay," he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This changes things. Kyle's threat isn't just a clumsy attempt at intimidation. It's a declaration of war. He's telling us how he plans to attack. And that means we can no longer afford to just build our fortress and wait for them to lay siege. We need to know exactly what kind of enemy we're dealing with." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. "Mr. Hayes, the Community Land Trust will protect your house. It will protect your wife's legacy. But Kyle's threat is aimed directly at you. He's trying to discredit you as a man. To do that, he'll have to create a narrative that you're senile and confused. We need to create our own narrative, a narrative based on the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I have a man I use for sensitive cases, a private investigator. He's discreet, he's thorough, and he's the best in the business. I want to put him on your son-in-law. I want to know everything, his finances, his business dealings, his associates, any skeletons he might have in his closet. Kyle thinks he's a predator hunting a weak old man. It's time we reminded him what it feels like to be the prey." He was no longer just my lawyer. He was my general laying out a plan of attack. There was no hesitation in my mind. Kyle had crossed a line from which there was no return. "Do it," I said, my voice as hard as the steel in my soul. "Find everything." The week that followed was a strange and quiet time for me. While Brianna and Kyle were likely growing more agitated, my life fell into a silent, patient routine. But beneath the surface, a hidden engine was humming to life, working tirelessly in the shadows. I never met the investigator. Anthony insisted it was better that way. His name was just a name, his presence a ghost in the machine. But I could feel his work being done. I imagined him first in a darkened room, the only light coming from a bank of computer monitors. His fingers would be a blur across the keyboard, a silent dance pulling threads from the vast invisible web of the internet. He would be peeling back the layers of Kyle's carefully constructed online persona. The smiling photos with Brianna, the LinkedIn profile boasting of financial genius, the confident posts about market trends, all of it would be stripped away. Beneath it, he would find the digital breadcrumbs Kyle thought he had erased, deleted posts from old forums, a hidden social media account with a different name, a trail of online credit applications, each one more desperate than the last. Then I pictured him on the phone. Not in a fancy office, but in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, his voice a low, indistinguishable murmur. He would be talking to old college acquaintances, disgruntled former business partners, people from Kyle's past who had been burned by his ambition and charm. Each call would be a small, careful chip in the marble facade of my son-in-law, revealing the flawed stone beneath. Each conversation would add another piece to the puzzle, another name, another date, another debt. The quiet digital work would then give way to the patience of physical surveillance. I saw the investigator in my mind's eye, a man who could blend into any background, sitting in a nondescript sedan parked down the street from Kyle and Brianna's upscale condo. He would have a camera with a lens long enough to see the stress on Kyle's face as he argued with Brianna on their balcony. The work would take him to the polished, soulless lobbies of the corporate buildings where Kyle claimed to have meetings, only for the investigator to watch him walk straight through and out the back door. And then he would follow the real trail. Not to boardrooms, but to the dim, smoky back room of an illegal poker club where the investigator's camera would capture Kyle throwing down chips. He didn't have his face a mask of sweat and desperation. He would follow him to a dimly lit parking garage where a long-lens photo would capture Kyle handing a thick envelope to a man with a broken nose and eyes that held no kindness. He would document the late-night visits to a check-cashing store in a part of town Kyle would never admit to visiting, a place that charged predatory interest rates. Finally, I imagined the investigator back in his quiet room, the hunt complete. The disparate pieces of information, the database printouts, the surveillance photos, the transcribed phone calls would all be assembled. They would be organized, cross-referenced, and compiled into a single professional report. It wouldn't be a story of a struggling entrepreneur. It would be a cold, factual biography of a liar, a gambler, and a fraud. I could almost hear the quiet satisfaction in his voice as he picked up the phone to make one final call, the only one that truly mattered. A call to Anthony Reed with a simple, devastating message: "I've got him." The call from Anthony came 2 days later. "He's got it, Mr. Hayes," was all he said. "Can you come down to the office?" When I arrived, a third man was already seated at the small round table with Anthony. He was unremarkable in every way, medium height, medium build, dressed in simple slacks and a polo shirt. He could have been an accountant or a high school history teacher. He was utterly invisible, which I realized was what made him so brilliant at his job. Anthony made the introductions, and then the investigator opened a slim folder on the table. There were no dramatic flourishes. He simply began to speak, his voice flat and professional, laying out the ugly truth of my son-in-law's life piece by damning piece. "We'll start with the finances," the investigator said, pushing a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a list of debts. "Mr. Thompson is not a savvy investor, Mr. Hayes. He's a desperate gambler. We've confirmed over $117,000 in outstanding markers to various online sports betting sites and 2 illegal poker rooms. He's also maxed out 6 personal credit cards and has taken out 2 high-interest payday loans in the last month alone. He isn't funding a business. He's trying to stay one step ahead of the people he owes money to, and he's losing." I looked at the numbers. It was a portrait of sheer desperation. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My daughter, with her brand new MBA, had hitched her future to a drowning man. "Next, The investigator continued, "The business itself." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a sleek, professional-looking website for a company called Biogen Innovations. "This is the biotech startup he pitched to you. It looks impressive. The problem is it doesn't exist. The address listed is a P.O. box. The partner testimonials are stock photos with fake names. We contacted the two lead scientists he lists on the site. One is a retired community college chemistry teacher who has never heard of Kyle Thompson. The other died in 2018. The entire company is a digital fiction, a convincing lie built to defraud potential investors. My daughter wasn't just complicit in a bad business deal. She was a partner in a complete and utter fraud. The sadness I felt was profound, a heavy weight that settled on my soul. This wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation of a truth I had already started to suspect. And finally, the investigator said, his voice dropping slightly, "This is the most serious part." He placed a final document on the table. It was a printout of an online loan application made to a shady out-of-state lender. It was a request for a $100,000 bridge loan against the equity of my house. And at the bottom in the space for the digital signature was my name. "He didn't just plan to ask you to sign, Mr. Hayes. He already tried to do it himself. He used your social security number, which he likely got from your daughter, and forged your electronic signature. We have the IP address logs. The application was submitted from his home computer 3 days ago, the day after you first told him you couldn't find the deed." Anthony Reed leaned forward, his voice like ice. "That's not just a family dispute anymore, Mr. Hayes. That is a federal crime. It's called wire fraud, and it carries a sentence of up to 20 years in prison." I stared at the forged signature, my own name twisted into a weapon against me. The sadness was still there, but now it was joined by a cold, righteous anger. The game had changed. This was no longer just about protecting a house. It was about delivering justice. A few days later, I was back in Anthony Reed's office. The investigator's damning report sat on the corner of the table, a silent testament to Kyle's treachery, but it was no longer the focus of our attention. Its purpose had been served. It had confirmed the necessity of our actions. Today was not about tearing down, it was about building up. Anthony had a thick stack of documents neatly arranged in front of me. They were the culmination of days of tireless legal work. The articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the property transfer deeds. Together they formed the legal architecture of the fortress we were about to construct. "This is it, Mr. Hayes," Anthony said, his voice imbued with a quiet solemnity. "Once you sign these, there's no going back. The house will officially and irrevocably belong to the trust." I nodded, my heart calm and steady. There wasn't a shred of doubt left in my soul. He slid the first document in front of me and pointed to the signature line. I picked up the heavy fountain pen he offered. It felt strange in my hand, a hand more accustomed to the heft of a wrench or the grit of engine grease. For 40 years, these hands had worked to provide for my family, to build a future for my daughter. Now, with a simple stroke of a pen, they would be used to protect that legacy from the very person I had built it for. I moved through the pages, signing my name where Anthony indicated. Each signature felt less like a legal formality and more like a prayer. I wasn't just signing papers. I was sealing a promise I had made to my wife 40 years ago, a promise to honor the home we had built together. Then I came to the final, most important document. It was the official charter, the document that gave the trust its name and its soul. And there, printed in bold official letters, was the title, "The Diane Hayes Community Trust." Seeing her name there, so solid, so permanent, a wave of profound peace washed over me. The anger and the hurt that had been my constant companions for weeks finally receded, replaced by a feeling I could only describe as grace. This wasn't an act of vengeance against my daughter. It was an act of devotion to my wife. Brianna had tried to turn our home into a monument to her own greed, but with these signatures I was transforming it into an eternal monument to her mother's love. I could almost feel Diane's presence in the room, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, her warm smile filled with approval. This was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. I took a deep breath and signed my name for the last time. The ink flowed smoothly onto the page, a dark, definitive line. It was done. I leaned back in my chair, the pen still in my hand, and a feeling of absolute serenity settled over me. The storm inside me had passed. The fight wasn't over. I knew that. The final confrontation was still to come. but I would not be fighting out of anger or a desire for revenge. I would be defending this, defending Diane's name, defending the community she loved. I looked at Anthony, and he gave me a slow, respectful nod. We hadn't just won a legal battle. We had consecrated a memory. We had built a fortress. And my soul, for the first time in a long time, was at peace within its walls. As I sat in the quiet of my living room that evening, the signed documents safely on their way to be filed with the county, a strange thought occurred to me. I wondered what Brianna and Kyle were doing at that exact moment. I didn't have to wonder for long. I knew their character so well I could picture the scene as if I were watching it on a television screen. They wouldn't be at home worrying. They would be celebrating. In my mind's eye, I saw them. They were seated at a small table in one of those new, ridiculously expensive restaurants downtown. The kind with mood lighting so dim you can barely read the menu, and where the portions of food are so small they look like a mistake. Brianna would be wearing a new dress, something sleek and black that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to. Kyle would have his tie loosened, just so, leaning back in his chair with an air of smug satisfaction, a glass of overpriced red wine swirling in his hand. They would look like the power couple they were so desperate to become, projecting an image of success that was built on a foundation of lies and a house that was no longer theirs to take. I could almost hear their conversation, a symphony of greed and delusion. "I'm thinking of quitting the firm," Brianna would say, pushing a piece of artfully arranged fish around her plate. "The work is so tedious, and once the loan comes through, I should really be focusing on managing our portfolio full-time." Kyle would laugh, a short barking sound of pure arrogance. "See, I told you the old man would fold," he'd say, his voice low and conspiratorial. "He just needed a little push. That threat about having him declared incompetent, that was a masterstroke if I do say so myself. He was probably terrified." He'd take a sip of wine, savoring his supposed victory. "He's from a different generation, Bree. They don't understand how assets work. They get emotionally attached to things like houses. For us, it's just seed capital, the first step to building our empire." Maybe in my imagination, Brianna would feel a fleeting pang of guilt. A flicker of her mother's conscience might surface in her eyes. "He just seemed so sad," she might murmur. But Kyle would be quick to extinguish it. "Sad," he'd scoff. "He's had his whole life to build wealth. We're just taking what's rightfully yours, what you deserve, after putting up with him for all these years. This isn't about him. This is about us, our future." And she would nod, convinced, her moment of doubt passing as quickly as it came. She would allow his greed to justify her own betrayal. The celebration would continue, their laughter echoing a little too loudly in the hushed restaurant. They would plan the trips they would take, the cars they would buy, the life they would lead, all financed by a ghost, by a home that had already been given a higher purpose. The scene in my mind would end with Kyle raising his glass, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, catching the candlelight. And I could hear the words he would say as clearly as if he were sitting right next to me. "To us, babe," he'd declare, clinking his glass against hers, "and to the house that will finance our future." And they would drink, completely oblivious, toasting a future that had already turned to smoke and ash just a few hours before. They were celebrating in a graveyard and had no idea. 2 days passed. 2 days of complete silence. I didn't call them, and they didn't call me. I let them sit with my silence, letting their anxiety and greed fester. I needed them to be at the breaking point, desperate for any sign of victory. Then on Friday morning, I decided it was time. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where they had laid out their demands, and I rehearsed what I was about to do. I practiced making my voice sound old and tired, letting my shoulders slump and breathing a little heavier than usual. It was a performance, perhaps the most important one of my life. I was about to play the part of the defeated old man they so desperately wanted me to be. I took a few deep, ragged breaths, held the phone in a slightly trembling hand, and dialed Brianna's number. She picked up immediately, her voice a whip-crack of tension. "Dad, Brianna." I began letting my voice sound thin and reedy, a shadow of its former self. I let out a long, slow sigh, the kind of sound a man makes when the fight has gone out of him. I'm tired, honey. I'm just so tired of all this." I could hear her hold her breath on the other end of the line, sensing a shift. I could also hear the faint, muffled sound of Kyle whispering to her, telling her what to say. "What do you mean, Dad?" she asked, her voice softer now, cautious, like a hunter approaching a wounded animal. I mean, you're right, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth even though they were a lie. You and Kyle, you're right. I've been thinking about what you said, about this house. It's just a building full of ghosts, and I'm an old man. What do I need all this for? I injected a little tremor into my voice. Your mother, Diane, she would have wanted you to be happy, to have a good future. She wouldn't want this old house to stand in the way of that. It was a calculated twisting of the truth, a perversion of Diane's memory that made my stomach turn, but it was the perfect bait. I heard more whispering, more urgent this time. So, Brianna said slowly, does this mean you've found the deed? I have. I lied, my voice filled with a weary resignation. It was right where I thought it was. I'm looking at it now. I paused, letting another heavy sigh fill the silence. I've been selfish, honey, trying to hold on to the past. But Kyle is right. You have to make your assets work for you. That's the modern world. I could almost feel their excitement vibrating through the phone. They were completely hooked. Listen, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I don't want to fight anymore. Let's get this over with. Why don't you and Kyle come over on Saturday morning? Say 10 o'clock. Bring all the papers you need me to sign. Bring your lawyer if you want. I want everything to be transparent so there are no more arguments. There was a moment of stunned silence on their end, followed by a poorly stifled sound of pure triumphant joy. It was Kyle. Of course, Julius, he said, grabbing the phone from Brianna. His voice was smooth as silk, oozing with false magnanimity. That's a very wise decision. We'll be there. 10 o'clock Saturday. We'll bring everything we need to finalize the transfer. You're doing the right thing. For everyone. I know, I said, my voice sounding hollow and defeated. I'll see you Saturday. I hung up the phone before they could hear the ice forming in my voice. I placed the phone gently back on the table. My hand was no longer trembling. My breathing was deep and even. The performance was over. The stage was set, and the final act was about to begin. I sat there for a long time after the call, the phone cool against my palm. My part was done, the bait laid. Now I just had to wait for the trap to spring. And just like before, I didn't have to wonder what was happening on their end of the line. I could picture it with perfect, painful clarity. I imagined the moment I hung up. A split second of stunned silence would have filled their pristine white apartment, followed by an explosion of triumphant energy. Brianna would let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated relief, her carefully maintained composure shattering into a million pieces of joy. She would throw her arms around Kyle, laughing, the tension of the past week melting away from her in an instant. And Kyle, my God, Kyle would be basking in it. He would be puffing out his chest, a conquering hero in his own small, sordid drama. He would let her celebrate for a moment before holding her at arm's length, a smug, all-knowing grin spreading across his face. "What did I tell you, babe?" he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "What did I tell you?" Brianna, still giddy with relief, might say something like, "I can't believe it was that easy. I was so worried he was going to fight us forever." And that would be the opening Kyle was waiting for. He would shake his head as if explaining a complex theory to a simple child. It's not about easy, Bri. It's about strategy. It's about finding the right pressure point and applying it until they break. He'd walk over to their wine fridge, pulling out a bottle of champagne they had likely bought in anticipation of this very moment. The pop of the cork would be their starting gun. As he poured the bubbling liquid into 2 tall flutes, he would deliver his sermon of self-congratulation. "That call I made yesterday, the one about his mental competence, that was the kill shot. See these old guys, they're all about pride. They're terrified of looking weak or foolish. The thought of being dragged into a courtroom to have his own daughter question his sanity, that was a humiliation he couldn't bear. It was the perfect move." He would hand her a glass, his eyes gleaming with self-admiration. "See, every old man has his price." He would say the words laced with a casual cruelty that still managed to take my breath away even in my imagination. His was his pride. You just have to know how to squeeze. They would toast, they would drink, they would start planning their new life. Their voices, a cheerful buzz of brand names and exotic locations. They would talk about the future as if it were a check that had already been cashed. I imagined them there, bathed in the afternoon light of their expensive apartment, completely blind to the reality of their situation. They were celebrating on the edge of a cliff, drunk on a victory that was nothing but a mirage. The scene in my mind faded, and I was left with the quiet reality of my kitchen. The only sounds were the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. There was no joy on my face, no triumph, just the cold, calm, patient expression of a man who had dug a very deep hole and was now simply waiting for his enemies to walk right into it. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, a beautiful day for an execution. I spent the morning cleaning the house, not out of nervousness, but out of respect for what was about to happen. I polished Diane's picture on the mantelpiece, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat in my armchair waiting. At precisely 10 o'clock, a brand new silver BMW I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. It gleamed in the sunlight. An alien spaceship landed in my humble working-class world. They didn't come to the door together. Kyle got out first, dressed in a sharply tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed. He opened the passenger door for Brianna, who emerged looking like she was heading to a corporate board meeting, not her father's home. She wore a severe-looking pantsuit and heels that clicked aggressively on my concrete walkway. They were followed by a third man carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He had the same look as Kyle, expensive suit, confident stride, and the dead-eyed expression of a man who calculates value in dollars and cents and nothing else. This had to be their lawyer. I opened the door before they had a chance to ring the bell. "Good morning," I said, my voice even and calm. "Please come in." They stepped inside, their presence immediately seeming to suck the warmth out of the room. They looked around my living room, not with nostalgia, but with the detached air of developers assessing a property for demolition. Kyle's lawyer didn't even bother to make eye contact with me. He just scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on the man sitting quietly in the armchair opposite mine. Anthony Reed. He was dressed simply in a sweater and slacks, looking more like a concerned neighbor than a high-powered attorney. His presence seemed to slightly unnerve them, an unexpected variable in their perfect equation. "This is my legal counsel, Anthony Reed," I said calmly. "I thought it was best if he was present just to make sure everything is transparent." Kyle exchanged a quick, arrogant glance with his own lawyer, a look that said, the old man brought a little league player to a professional game. They were not intimidated. They were amused. "Of course," Kyle said, his voice magnanimous. "Transparency is key." His lawyer stepped forward and placed his briefcase on my coffee table with a loud, definitive thud. He opened it and began arranging stacks of paper in neat, intimidating piles. They were ready for a quick, clean surgical procedure. A simple signing, a transfer of assets, a victory. They were so sure of themselves, so blinded by their own greed that they couldn't feel the storm that was about to break right over their heads. They had walked into the fortress, and the gate was about to swing shut behind them. Kyle's lawyer, whose name I didn't bother to ask, gave Anthony a dismissive smirk and turned his attention back to the coffee table. "All right, Julius," he said, his tone patronizing as he tapped a thick document with a manicured finger. "This is the primary equity transfer agreement. It essentially assigns the controlling interest of the property's value to my clients for use as collateral. It's all very standard. If you'll just sign here and here." He pushed the document and a pen across the table toward me. I didn't move. I just looked at Anthony. A silent signal passed between us. It was time. Anthony leaned forward in his chair, not aggressively, but with the calm, deliberate movement of a master chess player about to take a queen. He placed a hand gently on the papers, stopping their forward progress. "I'm afraid my client won't be signing that," he said. His voice was polite, almost conversational, yet it cut through the room's smug atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. Kyle's lawyer froze, his hand still outstretched. He looked at Anthony as if he were a bug he'd just noticed on his expensive suit. "Excuse me," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "And you are—" "I'm Anthony Reed," he replied smoothly, "counsel for Mr. Hayes. And as I said, he won't be signing those documents, or any others you might have brought with you today. You see, there appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding on your part." Kyle laughed a short, ugly bark. "A misunderstanding? I think it's all pretty clear. Julius agreed to the transfer. We're just here to make it official." Anthony turned his calm, steady gaze from the lawyer to Kyle. "The misunderstanding," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more precise, "is that you seem to believe Mr. Hayes is the legal owner of this property." A confused silence fell over the room. Brianna, who had been looking at her phone, finally looked up, a frown creasing her brow. Her lawyer let out an incredulous snort. Of course he owns the property. We ran a title search last week. It's clean. Ah, Anthony said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Last week. A lot can happen in a week. He reached into his own simple briefcase, which had been resting by his chair, and pulled out a single official-looking document. He placed it gently on top of their mountain of papers. As of 72 hours ago, an irrevocable transfer of ownership was filed and recorded with Mecklenburg County. Mr. Hayes is no longer the owner of this house nor the land it sits on. Therefore, he has no legal authority to sign any documents related to its equity. The lawyer stared at the document, his mouth slightly agape. He was speechless. Kyle's face was a storm of confusion and dawning rage. "What are you talking about?" Brianna demanded, her voice rising. "If Dad doesn't own it, who does?" Anthony's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something that looked like pity in his eyes. He let the question hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. "The new legal owner of this property," he announced, his voice clear and resonant in the suddenly silent room, "is a non-profit charitable organization established in perpetuity to serve this community." He paused, letting the words sink in, then he twisted the knife. "It's called the Diane Hayes Community Trust." My wife's name. In my living room it landed with the force of a physical punch. Brianna flinched as if she had been struck, the color drained from her face. Their lawyer snatched the paper off the table. As he read it, his professional mask of arrogance began to crack, crumbling into sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The game had changed. The battlefield had vanished, and they were only just beginning to realize the depth of their defeat. For a moment, there was nothing but a stunned, ringing silence. Kyle's lawyer was staring at the trust document as if it were written in a foreign language, but the silence was broken by Kyle. He shot to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of purple rage. "This is garbage," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Some kind of trick. You can't just give a house away. We had an agreement. This is my future you're messing with." He took a threatening step toward me, but Anthony didn't even flinch. He simply raised a hand, not in fear, but as a signal to stop. "I'd advise you to sit down, Mr. Thompson," Anthony said, his voice dropping into a dangerously calm register. "Because we are not finished, and you are in no position to be making threats." Kyle's lawyer, finally finding his voice, sputtered, "This is outrageous. We'll contest this. We'll sue. We'll prove in court that Julius was coerced, that he wasn't of sound mind." It was the very threat Kyle had made on the phone now being wielded by his legal attack dog. But it was a bluff, and Anthony knew it. "You could certainly try," Anthony said, a thin, cold smile on his face. "But a lawsuit requires discovery, and I'm not entirely sure your client wants his financial situation subjected to that kind of scrutiny." He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker folder. It was the investigator's report. He didn't open it. He just dropped it onto the coffee table. The sound it made, a heavy, solid thud, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "What is that?" Brianna asked, her voice trembling. Anthony looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes softened for just a second. "That," he said gently, "is the truth." He then turned his gaze back to Kyle, and the ice returned. "That is a detailed report on your husband's finances, Brianna. For example, did you know he is currently $117,450 in debt to various illegal gambling operations?" I watched my daughter's face. Her eyes, wide with confusion, darted to Kyle. "Kyle, what is he talking about?" Kyle just stood there, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was speechless. Anthony wasn't finished. "And that biotech startup, the one that was supposed to make you millions," he continued, his voice relentless. "It's a complete fabrication. A website built on lies. The lead scientist he lists on his prospectus has been dead for 3 years." The camera of my mind zoomed in on Brianna. The world around her seemed to fade away. There was only her and the man she had married, the man she had betrayed her own father for. Her face was a slow-motion shatter of disbelief turning into dawning horror. The man she thought was a financial genius, a brilliant visionary who was going to build her an empire, was being exposed layer by layer as nothing more than a desperate, broke, pathetic liar. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto her husband's. And in that look, I saw the first crack in their toxic alliance. I saw the first tremor of the internal earthquake that was about to tear their world apart. "Kyle," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is any of this true?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't even look at her. The second layer of the payoff had landed not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating implosion of trust. Kyle stood frozen, the blood draining from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of guilt. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another lie, but no words came out. His lawyer, seeing his client's obvious guilt, tried to intervene to regain some semblance of control. "Now hold on a minute," he blustered, trying to sound authoritative. "Allegations of debt and a failed business venture are one thing, but—" He never got to finish his sentence. Anthony Reed cut him off, not by raising his voice, but by making one final deliberate movement. He reached into the folder of the investigator's report and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He didn't drop it. He didn't slide it. He placed it precisely in the center of the coffee table on top of everything else. It was the printout of the online loan application. My forged signature was clearly visible at the bottom. "This is not an allegation," Anthony said, his voice as cold and hard as a judge's gavel. "This is a crime." He tapped the paper with his index finger. 3 days ago, your client, Mr. Thompson, used Mr. Hayes' social security number and other personal information to apply for a $100,000 loan against this property, an application he submitted from his home computer. He did this without Mr. Hayes' knowledge or consent. He electronically forged his signature. He paused, letting the full weight of the accusation settle in the silent room. "In the United States legal system," he continued, his eyes locked on Kyle's lawyer, "we have a name for that. It's called wire fraud, and it is a federal offense that carries a penalty of up to 20 years in a federal prison." The effect of those words was immediate and absolute. The last bit of bluster evaporated from Kyle's lawyer. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a flash of pure professional panic. He knew Anthony was right. This was no longer a civil dispute over a house. This was a criminal case with a slam-dunk piece of evidence right in the middle of the table. He immediately turned to Kyle, who looked like he was about to be physically sick, and made a sharp slicing motion with his hand across his own throat. It was a clear, desperate signal. "Shut up. Do not say another word." The game was over. The checkmate was complete. The hunter had not only been caught in a trap, but he was now staring down the barrel of a gun. The entire power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably shattered. There were no more negotiations. There were no more threats. There was only the cold, hard, undeniable proof of a crime and the terrifying silence of a future that had just been utterly and completely destroyed. The final piece of evidence hung in the air, a guillotine blade ready to drop. Kyle was a statue of guilt, silenced by his own lawyer. But Brianna finally broke. All the ruthless ambition, the polished MBA persona, all of it just crumbled away, leaving behind a terrified woman staring into the wreckage of her life. Her eyes darted from the forged document on the table to her husband's ashen face, and then finally to me. The cold defiance was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading panic. She took a stumbling step forward, her hands slightly outstretched as if to ward off the disaster that had already arrived. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dad, I'm sorry." The words were a pathetic whimper in the crushing silence of the room. "I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know about the gambling, but about all that debt. He told me it was a sure thing. I thought—" Her voice trailed off, her apology dissolving into a string of weak excuses. She wasn't apologizing for betraying me. She was apologizing for getting caught. She was mourning the loss of her fantasy, not the destruction of her family. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound and weary sadness. It was all too little and far, far too late. I looked at my daughter, this stranger with a familiar face, and her pathetic, self-serving apology washed over me without leaving a mark. I felt nothing but a deep, cavernous sadness for the little girl she used to be. I slowly shook my head, not in anger, but in a final, quiet dismissal. "You still don't get it," I said, my voice low and heavy, with a grief that felt older than time itself. "It was never about the house, Brianna. It was never about the money." I took a step toward her, and for the first time she recoiled, finally understanding that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. "You didn't just betray me," I continued, my voice steady. "You betrayed everything your mother stood for. She built a legacy of community, of looking out for people, of love, and you tried to sell it. To sell her. To pay off the gambling debts of a common thief." I pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "Her memory lives in the walls of this house, and you treated it like an ATM. There is nothing left to say. Now get out of my mother's house." My final words hung in the air, an uncrossable line drawn in the dust of our broken family. Their lawyer, seeing that the game was well and truly over, quickly gathered his papers and ushered his disgraced clients out the door. The sound of my front door clicking shut was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. And then there was silence. A deep, profound quiet that felt different from the loneliness that had haunted this house for weeks. It was not an empty silence. It was a peaceful one. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing. Then I walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up the framed photograph of Diane. Her smile, so full of life and love, beamed back at me. I gently wiped an imaginary speck of dust from the glass with my thumb. There was no triumph in my heart, no joy in their destruction. There was only a quiet, deep, and abiding peace. My wife's legacy was safe, the fortress had held, and my soul was finally truly at rest. This experience has taught me a hard but vital lesson. A true legacy isn't measured in dollars or the value of a property. It's measured in the love, principles, and community you build over a lifetime. I learned that when greed infects a family, it can blind them to the sacrifices that were made in their name. Protecting your legacy sometimes means protecting it from the very people you built it for. It's not an act of revenge, but a final, painful act of love to preserve the values that truly matter, ensuring they can't be sold for a quick profit. What do you believe is the most important legacy a person can leave behind? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please like and subscribe if you believe that some things are more valuable than money.